Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for finding your way up through the secret staircase, the secret elevator. I'm glad you got here. And this is a very good crowd for the Strand, so I'm thrilled for Anya. First of all, Anya and I have been friends for a long time, so you guys are going to either benefit from that or you might feel a little left out, but I promise I'm going to leave lots of time for you to ask your questions. We're going to chat for about 25 minutes, then we're going to open it up to your questions. Ask Anya anything you want, even embarrassing questions. It's good, she can handle it. And then Anya is going to sign books, and all of you are going to buy them, because if you haven't read it yet, her book is absolutely brilliant, and she's going to tell us some of the best stories in it. So, first question for Anya is, I have known you for so long as a cookbook writer, as a magazine writer, and then a couple of years ago you started talking about writing this memoir, and I remember very distinctly thinking, this is going to be very different. How did you make that transition between your different voices?
Well, you know, there's something that always kind of haunted me about my past. And, you know, I come from a culture where, you know, we were deprived of food for most of the time, and we were stood in a really, really long line. And the fact that I became a kind of a yum-yum journalist, you know, working, you know, writing about all these incredible restaurants for magazines, the irony was never lost on me. And every time I would eat like a piece of foie gras or truffle, I mean, there was a shadow kind of haunting me, the shadow of my past life, and of what food meant to us when we didn't have it or didn't have enough or had to queue up for it. There was something, you know, I wanted to bring something more existential, something darker, something kind of fuller and more complicated in relation to food. And, you know, looking at our Soviet past and Soviet experience seemed like, you know, a great way to, you know, but it was in a way a personal project to exercise those shadows, those demons of the past, and also, you know, to bring to life the human side of the Soviet story.
You know, that's interesting, because when I was reading the book, one of the things that occurred to me is, oh my God, you were hungry for so long. You know, and the hunger in the book is as powerful as the food in the book, you know, the absence of food. And I was wondering how you reconcile that with your everyday food writing life, because you're writing about some of the most rarefied, you know, exquisite dishes in the whole world. Is that shadow with you then, or is it something that you've sort of put to the side and then it came out in this book?
Well, you know, my generation, I can't say it would be over-dramatizing to say that we were actually hungry. My mother's generation, right, who went through Stalinism, who went through World War II, I think, you know, the shadow of, you know, this former hunger kind of changed their relationship to food quite dramatically. For me, for the longest time, before Russia became, you know, the land of the oligarchs and sushi flown in from Tokyo, when I just started writing about food, you know, in the early 90s, our relatives were still struggling. You know, they weren't starving, they weren't hungry, but food was still a matter of uncertainty and anxiety and of just like long withering lines. And I remember just feeling, my mom and I were talking about it all the time. We would eat something and feel incredibly guilty that here we were eating this, and, you know, like wondering how could we send a bite to our relatives. My mom said, well, I wish they would invent a machine, you know, this chute, you know, that you could just like send something, you know, what we're eating to Russia.
And of course, when you visited, you didn't get to visit very much, though. You write about the very long absence from when you came here in the 70s to your next visit.
Well, we left in 1974 as stateless refugees as part of the, you know, small Jewish immigration. And we had to surrender our citizenship. Not only that, we were charged an equivalent of 2 years' salary to do that. It was just like this humiliating thing, and we left for dead. We were never to go back. So, you know, when we said goodbye to Moscow, it was forever.
And you didn't just leave, I mean, you left some of your family there, you didn't just
My father, yeah, my mother's parents, you know, it was just me and my mom. And then by just a stroke of, you know, historical luck for us, you know, came Perestroika and Gorbachev, and when we went back in '87 after 13 years, it was really like this miracle, and I very, very strongly felt like we were coming back from the dead. It was just eerie.
And when you first came, tell us about, you landed in Philadelphia. It was the middle of the winter. You had no coat. Tell us about how you guys survived and who helped you and how you made your way.
We actually were very lucky because the Jewish immigration was set up through refugee agencies, like Anyas, Jewish Family Service. So we had little stipends. We had bags of used, clothes from Jewish sponsors. But for me, the biggest trauma was the dramatic crash of my dream about zagranica, about going abroad, because I was obsessed with everything foreign. As most Moscow kids, of my generation, I was just dying to taste this foreign food. And here we come to Philadelphia, we discovered there are no sidewalks. We live in this suburban Philadelphia. There are no sidewalks. To go to the Pathmark, we actually have to go on this minor expressway. And then you get to this huge, I remember it was this funeral parlor, chill, fluorescent lights, really cold, and shelves just packed and packed and packed with all the stuff. We had no idea what it was. And the Russian immigrants had all kinds of different reactions. There were people who actually fainted, seeing 25 kinds of toilet paper. Women cried. They said, "Oh, we dreamt about American strawberries, and now we discovered they have no flavor and no smell." People bought floor wax, thinking it was butter, and they said, "Well, American butter is really disgusting." People bought these cute cans with pictures of kitties. Saying, "Oh, this is kind of a nice conserve, but why doesn't it have any seasoning?" But for me, I mean, my mother was besotted. She was besotted with America. She was very anti-Soviet. She knew why she left. And she would just caress all this packaging, cereal, Cheerios, Velveeta, and I would just carry the cart behind her like a zombie, because food without what it possessed in Russia, food without social prestige, without yearning, without desire, without that heroic verb das touch to get something with difficulty, suddenly it just lost its meaning. I completely lost my appetite. I would just look at this Wonder Bread in absolute horror, or Oscar Mayer's Bologna, or the stuff my mom would drag from the supermarket. She would Hormel's pickled pig's feet. We would just try all this stuff. Pop-Tarts that she didn't know that had to be toasted. So we ate them raw.
They're not so bad raw.
They were gross.
They're not, all right. Well, anyway.
Anyway, so it was, I mean, for me, it was just this huge, massive disappointment.
And how did, well, I kind of want to ask you, I want to follow the food thread a little more before we go into the history thread. How did you reconcile yourself and become a food writer? I mean, there you are, you're confronted with this food, you're not loving it. And then I know that you had other career ideas before ending up being a food writer. How did you get there?
Well, it was a long and kind of strange road. I wanted to be a concert pianist. I graduated from Juilliard, almost graduated, almost got my MA. I mean, food was in the back of my mind as something that kind of connected me back with the memories. And then I had a hand injury. I was about 24. I started relearning piano, just to make sure it was a professional injury. And because I remembered Italian, I started translating a cookbook for money, which was actually the Cucchiaia d'Argento, that came out,
right.
much later, this big Italian cookbook. And I thought, oh, maybe I should write my own cookbook about, the cuisines of the former Soviet Union. It was just on the lark. And my ex-boyfriend said, yeah, he was a writer. We found an agent. We started selling around the proposal, and everyone would go, oh, yuck, what, a book about bread lines? And then the last publisher was Workman Publisher, who just published The Silver Palette, which became the zeitgeist book of the late 80s. And they loved the proposal, and that just kind of by accident we fell into it. But it was very strange, because here this book called Please to the Table. It comes out in 1990. It's huge. It got the very first James Beard Award. It's dedicated to the cuisines of Russia, but also the former Soviet republics. Well, at that very moment, the Soviet republics are all separating. The Soviet Union is falling to pieces. It's collapsing. And one of the reasons it's collapsing is because there's no food.
So your book came out actually at the perfect moment to kind of commemorate that.
Exactly.
Do you want to tell the story of where you were when you found out about this, about the beginning of the collapse? Weren't you in Georgia?
Yeah, it was. Well, it was the end of the collapse, actually.
Right. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, it was. Well, yeah,
it was final, right.
There was the last day of the country called the Soviet Union. My friend and I were traveling now for his book about the empire as it was kind of imploding. So we would just hire a driver. There was no gas. It was just horrendous. All those republics were separating. There were civil wars, but we persevered, and we were in Abkhazia, which was a breakaway region of Georgia, in Sukhumi. Which was already, engulfed in civil war. It had no electricity, and they took us. Our hosts took us to the house of some prosperous winemaker that had electricity, and we started drinking at about 4. And the Georgian drinking, Abkhazian drinking is very complicated and ritualized. You have to say a toast for everyone at the table, and then everyone has to reciprocate. And imagine there are 40 people at the table. Every time, you drink this much wine. And then it was only men. And then I went to the kitchen to sit with the women, and suddenly Gorbachev comes on and makes his resignation speech. And it wasn't unexpected, but I remember exactly, it's described in the book, I remember exactly what we were eating. We were eating this chicken and walnut sauce and this kind of white polenta, Abkhaz polenta. And I remember this, spoonful of corn mush kind of freezing all the way to my mouth. And there's Gorbachev, saying thank you, compatriots, blah, 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 blah. And it was not unexpected. Everyone thought it was happening. But, the actual... and you just realize this is the most historic moment. This country, known as the USSR, is clanging into history. And so I always will think of Kormush at the end of the USSR. I think every time I eat white polenta, I keep thinking of that.
Your book is actually filled with historical moments that you bring vividly alive, and sometimes they're connected to food, often they are, and sometimes they're not. But this book is really hard to categorize. It's not just a memoir, it's not just a book about Soviet history, it's not just a cookbook, it's all of these 3 things brought together. And how was that for you to write, and why did you write it that way?
Well, I mean, immodestly, I thought of War and Peace.
Oh, just that little book.
That little book. No, it made this huge impression on me. When you're a Russian kid, you start reading War and Peace. Usually, you read the peace parts first because you're really bored with the war stuff. Like I haven't. And then you read. Every time you reread it, you read a little bit more and more and more of it. And it took me about 6 reads, to actually read the war stuff, which is really, it was so boring to me. And then it becomes fascinating because, the peace stuff. So that kind of structure that zooms in and out of, small human lives and like larger historical picture, immodestly, again, was, always in the back of my mind, because I was thinking, I didn't want to write a memoir. Because as an ex-Soviet person, one thinks of memoirs as something very narcissistic. I didn't feel like I had a personal story to tell that was interesting enough. I wanted to, through my story and through the food, show the history. And then the history kind of took over a little bit, and then the personal story would take over. And it was still kind of shapeless, and it was my mom, who is a docent at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she loves historic meals. And she just finished a whole year of testing something from a 19th century St. Petersburg family. And I said, so what are you going to do when that ends? And she said, why don't we do a history of the Soviet Union? And why don't we do it decade by decade? And I thought, well, this is an amazing structure. So the book starts 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940. And each chapter is kind of this tapestry of personal story, larger kind of historic epic that illuminates a personal story and the other way around. And this cooking chronicle of my mom and I in Queens, going on this sort of memory lane and cooking through the emblematic dishes and seeing what they evoke. But as you write it, I think you just wonder what turns pages. And so you start cutting things that are kind of dead, and there was so much that I had to throw out.
Yeah,
but in a way,
kittens, as they say.
you kind of feel your way through it and just see okay, and it's always in the end the personal story that keeps the narrative.
Well, they propel each other. They work so well together, especially, you start out, the first characters we meet are your grandparents. And you should talk about your grandfather a little bit, because he was such an interesting character, especially in World War II. But even before that, I wouldn't have thought, before I read that, I never really knew about your grandfather at all, and I knew your mom was such a rebel, so I never would have thought that your grandfather was such a party man. So it was an interesting thing to learn. Talk a little bit about him.
Yes, well, my father, Naum Solomonovich Frumkin, he was an idealistic Bolshevik of the old school. He was from the shtetl. He ran away from home when he was 13, never looked back, lied about his age, joined the army, and he was very charismatic, very handsome, and he went into intelligence, and he kept getting all these promotions. And when he and my grandmother met in Odessa in the late 1920s, he was the head of Black Sea Naval Intelligence. And then during the World War II, he was the head of the Baltic Naval Intelligence. And then he became deputy chief of naval intelligence. So he basically, we called him Granddad the Spy, and he would say, no, not the spy, intelligence worker. I'm an intelligence. There was this, and then he would say, no, counterintelligence. And he survived. My grandfather had this incredible luck, because initially the Bolshevism was really good for Jews. They could move through the ranks, and the Pale was dismantled. And then, starting late 30s, but especially after the war, there were persecutions. And then he wasn't arrested. It was a miracle, because he was, as a spy, he knew when he was being tailed. He knew he jumped into moving trolleys.
So he was very much at risk.
Oh, he was very much, because the intelligence, that's what I learned from doing the research thoroughly. The intelligence was completely decimated by purges, before the war. And then finally they came to arrest him, and he was away sick in the hospital, and it was the day that Stalin died.
Oh my God. So he was
he really had this incredible luck. Or he would, hold on to a mine in the sea because he couldn't swim, and the mine would forget to explode. Or, a bullet would, he just, the whole kind of history of my granddad is about him escaping these incredible situations.
And so how is it that your mother became such a rebel? And by the way, where is Marissa? Where is your, there she is. Hi.
Hi, Mom.
I should ask you that question.
Well, because I think Granddad, for all his charm, he was really, very pro-Soviet, and then came the thaw. Khrushchev, Stalin died. I think that the kind of big breaking point in the book, and then my mother's life, Stalin dies. And my mother, all her life, she felt like she was this little Cassandra of doom. She was at odds with a happy Soviet society. She felt like something was not right. At the same time, she really, like all the other children, she loved Comrade Stalin. He was like a second father to her.
Everybody felt that way.
Yeah, and when I asked my mother, it was for me this huge revelation. I said, so well, tell me what you remember about Stalin's death. Well, the first thing she said, well, those galoshes all over Moscow, because so many people got crushed in a funeral. And they said, well, how did you feel? And my mom wanted to be an actress, and she said, I felt this bitter disappointment that he will never come and see me in a play. And I thought, my God, this is like the totalitarian, this is the personality cult. This is like the real effect of it. At the same time, she had all these dissident thoughts. And when Stalin died, they were reconciled. Yeah. And then Khrushchev's thaw, brought this cult of, sincerity. Everyone was talking about it. And, the generations kind of broke up for a lot of people. And So the book is about 3 generations of Soviet people. You know, the idealistic grandparents who really believed in the system, the anti-Soviet, idealistically anti-Soviet, you know, third generation of, you know, Moscow intelligentsia, and then my generation, which is kind of cynical, and we just see the whole thing, the whole Soviet project, as a farce, essentially.
Do you want to talk about the meal that you and your mom made to commemorate Stalin's death?
Yes, that was. It was very funny. There was, you know, in some dissident circles, there was a tradition of, you know, celebrating Stalin's death. And as I was writing this chapter, you know, his death day came along, and Mom and I said, oh, well, you know, let's have a Stalin's death day gathering. I said, sure. So we started looking. My mom, she's very archival about approaching her menus. And we said, well, what should we cook? And we were leafing through the Stalinist cookbook, this book of tasty and healthy food. And
this book comes up a lot in your book has borrowed a lot from that book.
Yes, I mean, it was kind of the book that came out in 1939. It was like not just a cookbook, it was an ideological document. It was like the socialist, realist text that sort of advertised Soviet abundance that never really existed. And my mom said, oh, let's make chanahi, which is a Georgian dish, a clay pot Georgian dish. And I said, Mom, we can't make chanahi. It was Stalin's favorite dish. And so I go back, I said, okay, I'm going to go back and research. So I start reading again and again, because Stalin had the habit of calling, you know, his closest cronies to his dacha, which was very near where we lived, you know, late at night, and they would serve all this Eurasian sort of Russian, Georgian food, because he was Georgian. And I started looking through documents and recollections, and yes, it was Stalin's favorite dish. And my mom goes, oh, but I bought the eggplants, and I bought the lamb, and I bought everything. What are we going to do? And then she goes, okay, wasn't Stalin plotting an anti-Georgian purge? I said, yeah, he was actually, it was, you know, a move against Beria, was against Mingrelians, who are a minority of Georgians. My mom said, okay, it will be a tribute to the oppressed Georgians. So we had the Stalin's favorite dish on his death day. It was a little tough, the lamb, so my mom wasn't happy. But it made good.
But she was thrifty.
It made good reading.
And she was thrifty, and she used all the ingredients that she bought.
She used all the ingredients, and the recipe is in the book. It's actually really, really delicious.
I've had it.
I'm sorry to say about Stalin.
I can testify. It is delicious. In fact, I think I had it. I think you made it. I think actually,
my mom made it.
Let's talk about when you went back recently to do an article on when you went back to Moscow recently, when you were doing an article, and what that was like for you. I mean, you know, obviously you're coming back in kind of in this very privileged way. You're smack in the middle of everything, and you get to be on television. Well, tell us about that trip.
Well, first of all, one doesn't feel privileged at all. We used to come back during Perestroika, when, you know, the black market exchange to the dollar was huge, and, you know, you really felt like a privileged foreigner. Now you come back as like this pauper with no money to a city where coffee costs, you know, $15, and you go, oh my God, what am I going to do? So we were terrified of Moscow because of that, because it's like being at the airport. It's like shopping at the airport. Although, you know, we just went to Copenhagen, my boyfriend and I, and it was even more expensive. But the cocktail is like $30. So we rent this place in this modernist kind of boxy 60s building with a great view, you know. It's super expensive. And then my mom and I get invited to do a TV show. And they said, oh, you know, Soviet cuisine is really hot. Everyone, and you as an immigrant, you remember it better. So they said, we're going to pair you with a chef, and you're going to do a show. I come in, and the chef turns out to be an ex-chef of the Kremlin. And we're cooking on Kremlin monogrammed dishes. And there's this kind of towering set of bowls, of, you know, cut crystal red bowls. And I said, oh, and what's this? He said, oh, this was Stalin's bowls from Stalin's dacha. I said, the Stalin's dacha that was near my, you know, it was given to him on his 70th birthday. And I must say, it was just a really strange sensation to be touching a dish which Stalin's hand might have, I won't forget, it was coming, this weird chill that goes through you. And he made, we made this very Soviet, Kremlin-style banquet, and he told me all these amazing inside stories about cooking at the Kremlin. For instance, that there was looting.
There was what?
There was like, people stole, people
yeah.
stole everywhere,
Yeah.
but you think that people who worked for the Kremlin didn't steal, but no, he would inspect, his employees' lockers, and, he would get like 60 kilos of food. And, for instance, the milk people that delivered the milk, which was, from a special dairy, they would put clanking lids. So by the time it came in, there would be cream, and they would steal the cream that rose to the top. Yeah, people who worked for the Kremlin.
Well, not surprisingly. I mean, there was the plenty, and they were on the other side of it. So.
Well, no, I mean, actually working for the Kremlin, being a janitor, you got special tailors,
okay.
Crimean vacations, it was a really privileged spot, but they still stole.
And your family, you and your mom benefited a little bit from the association from your grandfather when you were growing up.
Very little. I mean, my grandfather, up to a certain point, had access to the closed supply depots, but, very modestly. It was all rank-based, so they would get a can of something, a can of tinned fish for the holidays, maybe a few oranges. It wasn't a big deal, but he was able to get me to attend the kindergarten for the Central Committee children, which was a boarding setup, and it was just an absolute heartbreak for me.
Because you were away from your mother and because of what they fed you?
Because I was away from my mother, because this kids, this nomenclatura, this Politburo kids, I really perceived them as, my mother was super anti-Soviet, so I perceived them as enemies. And they fed us all this incredible food, which I could not eat because I became bulimic, because I felt that with the food I was ingesting the ideology that my mother couldn't stomach. So it was just an absolute shock. Every meal, and then I would start dumping the food out behind the radiator until I got discovered. But it's all in the book. It's all in the book.
I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'm going to open it up to everybody else. Tell us what a poison madeleine is.
Sorry.
We let her have a drink, and then she'll tell you what a poison madeleine is.
Well, the book very much is about the complexity of food memories from, what was a terrible regime. You couldn't, Madeleine, is about an idealized childhood in, the Proustian sense. But what if your childhood, is ideologized? What if everything that you ate, just as I said, with the kindergarten, was kind of fraught with complications? What if, the food from your childhood, instead of just straight ahead nostalgia, brings back, this complex, conflicting memories? It's about, the kind of rich layering of emotions that those nostalgic foods represent for us. And the other thing is, what if the food that you might miss has been produced, distributed, sold by the party state that your mother fled and reviled? So the poison madeleine is almost like an overarching sort of way of showing the deep complexity and contradiction of coming from a complicated, difficult regime.
And yearning, but yet yearning for something from it.
Absolutely.
Okay, your questions. I know you must have many for Anya. So who would like to? Oh, all right, Barry, you start us off. Do we have a microphone for them?
We do, yeah.
Hello. Is the microphone working?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you can all hear us, right? Yeah. They would have told us if you couldn't.
Can you talk a little bit about, one of the things you talk about in the book is the culture of alcohol and alcoholism in the Soviet Union, one of my favorite chapters, because I have friends who... and also, your uncle was, I understand, a famous alcoholic. Could you explain why he was a famous alcoholic?
My uncle was a famous alcoholic because under the influence, he fell from the 6th floor of a very high building and survived. And he was, he was a member of the intelligentsia. He had a PhD, but he was part of that. Alcoholism, besides other things, it was a very kind of intense and interesting subculture. With its own folklore, with its own, sort of poetry, with the kind of roster of things that people drank, including nail polish remover, and my uncle was actually a legendary figure. If you ask, any old Moscow alcoholic if they've heard of him, they say, "Oh my God, he's your uncle." And my grandmother was a virtuoso drinker as well. And in the book, I talk a lot about the alcoholic subculture, and it all happens during Gorbachev's alcohol ban. When we go back to Moscow in 1987, suddenly there's no alcohol because Gorbachev has banned it, and it's like one of the reasons why he became so reviled.
Oh, actually, do you want to just talk a little bit, one question, which, thank you, Barry, because it reminds me, what was it like to write about your parents, your mom, who's obviously sitting right here, and your father, who was in Moscow? What was it like to write about them and touch on these sort of tender moments, like that you talk about your father being an alcoholic? And
well, I mean, being an alcoholic is kind of a good, it's
accepted.
It's something
it's
that
not
you're
even
proud. My father worked in the embalming lab of Lenin's mausoleum. So he had access to purest grade spirit, ethyl alcohol that, you put it down for rubbing optical surfaces. So it was, in that way, it was a very privileged work. And he also brewed moonshine from all this complicated paraphernalia that he pilfered from the mausoleum. So in our house, we had all this tubes and all the distilling equipment that he kind of put together from the mausoleum thing. But talking about one's parents is never easy. I think my mom is such a hero to me, and just such an interesting person. She had such an interesting childhood. It was an absolute joy, to come together with her over this project. My father hasn't read the book because he fortunately doesn't read English. He asked my mom.
It hasn't been translated?
We have a publishing contract, but no, not yet. I'm dreading the moment when it's going to be translated. But he asked my mom, "Oh, do I come out terribly?" My mom said, "Yeah, pretty terribly." But she said, as an artistic character, as a writerly character, am I a good character? She said, "Yes, you're a good character." She said, "Well, okay, then I'll forgive him."
That's great. Any other questions? Yes.
How how was the art of cooking preserved in the old Soviet Union, if it was?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the Bolsheviks did everything. I mean, the 1920s, the world has changed so drastically, and it was a moment of such rupture. The old order had to go, and part of it was kind of an attempt to, consciously destroy Tsarist cooking as part of, bourgeois world that had to go, and there were no ingredients. So I think the first 10 years, after the revolution, was really the hardest. But at the same time, there was NEP, the new economic policy, which allowed some private restaurants to remain open. And then under Stalin, there was more of a conscious effort to find the chefs and to kind of revive, because it was part of the whole kind of revival of pre-revolutionary values. Like Pushkin came back, Swan Lake came back, and some of the food, in Sovietized form, came back. And I talked to my mother a lot about it, about the old ladies who carried that memory without ingredients. And the one thing that you could actually do is bake, because flour, water, yeast, you could find it. And these women just possessed this magic of baking and the magic of yeast. And some of them were Smolyanki, they were educated at the Smolny Institute for Young Women. It was heartbreaking, the kind of skills that they lost. And they just could not be revived because there were no ingredients. So in a way, I think the real Russian cuisine kind of died. I mean, I don't think there was anyone that really could fully fully preserve it. You know, maybe around the Kremlin table, but even there, you know, the canteens of Smolny and of the Kremlin, they fired all the professional chefs and they hired new cadres. So even they couldn't cook. So even for the Politburo, they couldn't preserve this cuisine.
Why did they fire all the professional chefs? I would have thought
reorganizations of cadres.
Really?
Lenin, yes, they didn't want Tsarist, Tsarist people cooking.
Even chefs, okay.
No, especially,
Oh, because they were afraid of being poisoned, or?
No, it's just they wanted a new class
Right.
of person. So in fact, you know, in the Kremlin canteen, the food was so terrible that Lenin, who didn't care about food, had to order several investigations of like, there were rats, there were scurvy. I mean, it was really not a good situation.
Other question? Yes, right there.
I was growing up in a region during the Khrushchevs era. It was this corn era where all of a sudden bread disappeared. And they were just, we were staying in a line for 3 small corn breads for everyone. So before going to school, I was staying in a line together with my parents. Otherwise, somebody wouldn't be able to eat this day. Did you cover, I didn't read the book yet, as of yet, did you cover this situation in Russia, in Soviet Union, not only the Moscow, St. Peter, Leningrad area, but also the region?
Yeah, actually the chapter of my birth, 1960s, the 1960 decade begins with Khrushchev's corn campaign and the bread shortage. And it was actually, again, you know, how sort of the personal and political all interacted so much. My mom, you know, spent her pregnancy in bread lines because of the crop failure during Khrushchev. And then my father abandoned us because he couldn't stand the bread. And it was a very difficult year. And then Khrushchev obviously went bye-bye. And a lot of it had to do with that, you know, 1963 bread shortage and, you know, his crazy campaign to promote corn. Because in Russia, Khrushchev is known as kukuruznik, the corn man. And if you ask anyone, like people, I think people's notion of history, especially young people in Russia, is very fuzzy. I mean, they really don't remember don't know what was what. But if you ask them, if you ask Gorbachev, they say, oh yeah, the one who destroyed the country. You ask them Khrushchev, they say, oh yeah, corn man.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Hi, I have a question in terms of when you and your mom were leaving Russia, because your grandfather was so high up in the government ranks. We had some issues personally with my family, and we left much later than you guys did. We left around Perestroika. So how did that affect your mom's father? How did that affect your entire family? Were there repercussions?
Well, we weren't supposed to be let out. It was a complete mistake. My father, my mom's father was supposed to give her permission, written permission to leave, and he said absolutely no. So she forged his signature, and on the application form she put down that he was retired. And it was actually a very busy month for the immigration, for the visa office, and they just overlooked it. Because otherwise we would be totally refuseniks, you know, with his kind of ranking, we would never be allowed to leave. And he was saying, when my mom said, oh, we'll leave, she says, oh, they'll never let you out, they'll never let you out, they'll never let you out. So we come to Philadelphia, literally the first people who are waiting for us are the CIA. They come, they call my mom to a hotel room. You know, I'm still small, she leaves me at home, they call her, they interrogate her for like 24 hours. Finally getting closer, you know, where did you go to school when you were 7? What was the address of blah, 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 blah. Finally it said, well, there's this man, you know, he has the same last name as yours. We're really interested. Would you know him? She said, my mom said, look, you know he's my father. That's why you brought me here. And they're like, can we talk to him? Da, 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 da. In the meantime, in Russia, they realize what happened and they come to arrest him again. And it's his friend and sponsor, a very important World War II Admiral Tributz. He intervened. And otherwise, yeah, my father lost the job, lost his mausoleum job. Grandfather was almost arrested, and my mother was seared with guilt for many years.
Okay, on that note.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Anya, Melissa, thank you so much. Make sure you check out a copy of The Art of Soviet Cooking before you leave tonight. Also, make sure you check out the Leonard Lopate show tomorrow, as Anya will be featured on it. Thank you for coming, everybody. Have a good night.
I'm supposed to say one more thing, Barry. You can follow Anya on Twitter at Von Bremzen. And you can follow me too at Good Appetite. But follow Anya.
Yeah, I have like 3 followers. Melissa has 3,000. Melissa, thank you so much. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here at the Strand in this like Alibaba's cave of amazing books. Thank you.
So we have actually
Rachel, Kaylee. Thank you, everyone at Crown. Thank you all our friends for coming, and this wine and cheese and
Yeah. Also, Melissa's books are available for sale over by the Strand counter as well. Thank you.